Hi, and welcome back to Econ 202. This is Chapter 7 or Topic 7, Economic Growth. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what conditions help create economic growth in a nation, what's the relationship between labor's productivity and economic growth, in other words, how productive each worker is. We're going to look at contributors then to economic growth and talk a little bit about economic convergence, the advantages and disadvantages, but how economies, theory is, are converging towards more equity between the wealthiest and the poorest nations. I will tell you that you can look through this quote, and when you see quotes like this and you see a name you don't know, such as Richard Easterlin, which I wouldn't have known who Richard is, I just encourage you to look it up. So he's an economics professor at the University of Southern California, and it's an Easterlin paradox that he's talking about, that not that happiness is not a factor of money, but health and strong family relationships. And you'll note that there's a link here I'm going to go to in just a second. Showed up at the site. This is what came up, and you could do a quick tour. I'm going to just say maybe later. And I can look at how do people live in Vietnam or Burundi or France or China or Mexico. And there are lots of countries, and you can just kind of get a little bit of a sense for how those individuals live. And this is a resource you're going to use. This activity will also be on the last slide, and I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint. So again, that link to Dollar Street is something that I am encouraging you to make use of in our activity for this lecture. So in the 1800s, democracy and free market capitalism were developing in England, the Netherlands, and the United States. But until 1870, most people lived in poverty, and then there were landowners, the aristocrats, who would have lived much better, but that was not the norm. As market-based economies became more normal, and there was an expansion of the kind of goods and services being distributed and kinds of jobs that people could hold, there was a lot more upward mobility, and the average life of citizens improved, and innovation and creation really help to spur opportunities that did not exist. And they're fostered under a capitalistic market in ways that they don't seem to be under other kinds of market. Again, all markets are mixed. They have a degree of command. Even in the U.S., we have a number of industries that there are legal restrictions around how much can be produced, around what you can charge, and utilities about supporting markets that otherwise would go away because we're not willing to pay what they really cost. So we subsidize farmers in lots of settings in the U.S., for example. But by and large, free markets have done a lot to eradicate poverty. What I would say is if you do any current searching on this, you'll see that the pandemic is estimated to set us back in the alleviation, the fighting of poverty, a major initiative of the UN and many organizations and people around the world. And we've seen great progress in my lifetime. This pandemic is estimated to set us back at least 5 years, and some people estimate as much as 1 to 2 decades. So these are some things that are needed for growth. They're the conditions for growth, much like a plant needs light and water and a certain amount of good nutrients in its soil. Things like the rule of law, protecting private property owned by companies or individuals, the freedom of trade, the movement of financial resources, the movement of goods and services, even the movement of workers and labor, a sound, stable money supply that is not changing significantly. If you looked at Venezuela in the last several years, they've experienced hyperinflation at a level that's hard to imagine. Imagine showing up at the grocery store a week later and seeing prices have gone up tenfold, and you get an idea of what Venezuela has been experiencing. Small size governments relative to the size of the economy, meaning there's a lot more private sector that's a bigger piece of the economy. And you may recall 67% is consumer spending. It's only about 20% is the federal government, but there is concern that that could raise to 45%. And that makes it harder for those taxable entities to be able to carry the cost as government gets too large. Favorable demographics, good workforce, educated workforce, young workforce, capable workforce, growing workforce, those kinds of things. And then low tax regulation and government regulations that foster business as opposed to hinder or make it harder to get into business. But there's a degree of protection and kind of consistency of rules that's probably even more important than that. So these things can really move towards helping a economy to grow. And here's just a picture kind of showing some of what can lead to higher GDP, the workforce growing, human capital, people being more capable, they have more knowledge or more skill because of education or training, or they have better technology to be able to utilize, and physical capital. And then things that make each person then more productive, which gets at that GDP per capita in that second part of the picture. So what are some things that contribute to economic growth? Increases in capital that could be physical capital like machines. It's human capital, again, education and skill. We've made mention of those. It also means that we're deepening our capital when the amount of machines or the education or skill increases per worker. Improvements in technology, whether that's use of existing technology in new ways or whether that's completely novel or new inventions, can be really helpful. And we're seeing that in AI and nanotechnology and biotechnology, AI, artificial intelligence today. So when we look at the value of the physical capital measured by plant space, you can think of, and equipment, this computer I'm using and other things per person, what we have seen is over the course of time, the real US dollars being spent per worker on space and equipment has been increasing to the tune that by the end of this graph in 2010, it's at 30,000, and you can anticipate from the direction that in the last 10 years it's increased. What I can say is that there's a question about how the pandemic may be shifting this. There may be some unique technology you need from work from home, but there's also a significant savings maybe in physical plant or space that's needed for workers that are working from home. And so maybe we will actually see a slight decline in what's being spent per company, per worker. But when you go out and get employed, keep in mind that there's probably an investment of over $30,000 being made just to have space and equipment for you to do your job. We're also seeing rising levels of education, which is one way that we develop the workforce. So over that same period of time, we'd seen an increase in high school graduation rates, so that about 90% of Americans graduate with high school, and an increasing number of people earning a college degree, either a bachelor's or higher, and that number is closing in on 35% now in the U.S. So we can look at economies and we talk about convergence of economies. So we've talked about some of the things that help an economy to grow, creating that right fertile soil, if you will, similar to a plant growing. We've talked about how that growth matters, and I've even talked a little bit about some of the things happening in the world around us today, whether it's Venezuela. But if you were to look over the last couple of decades And I know this is going a little bit back in time, but you can see some fast growing countries. And if I asked you to name the fastest growing countries, maybe you would have thought of China or India, very large companies. I don't know if you would have thought of Laos or Mozambique or Cambodia or Uganda or Vietnam. And so it's interesting to see who is growing the fastest as a percentage of their economy year after year. And this is true for a number of these countries still today. Slower growing countries, some that may not be as surprising, maybe the Central African Republic, which has had a lot of internal conflict, wouldn't surprise you. But then you're going to see a number of countries that are in Europe or large economies like Japan, Switzerland, the United States, Germany, that represent some of the biggest economies outside of China. And you can see that our growth rates as a percentage have been much lower. And in fact, many of these economies will decline in 2020 due to the pandemic. So this is the idea that convergence is happening, that richer countries will grow at a slower rate than poorer countries, and eventually there will be more consistency, more equity between countries over time. So your project, your task for this particular lecture is to go back out to that Dollar Street. Hans Rosling has passed away, but he's the Swedish person who put this together. It's a really interesting look at what life is like in different parts of the world. Pick one country and look at life there and think about how that's different from what you personally experience, and make a short list of the differences. You can also add, some of the things that maybe are similar. And so as you study another part of the world and see how people live in that region, just compare that to your own experience where you grew up, whether that was here in the US or abroad. Thanks, and I'll look forward to talking to you next time.